A woman sits quietly in seat 14F, just another passenger nobody notices. The flight attendants smile and move past her. The businessman beside her assumes she works in an office. When the Boeing 737 starts shaking violently and the captain loses control, she walks to the cockpit and reveals a secret nobody expected. She is not an office worker. She is a combat fighter pilot with 15 years of impossible missions. Now she must land this dying aircraft on a highway, or everyone dies. Nobody knew until she saved them all. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun broke through the terminal windows at Denver International Airport as passengers shuffled toward Gate B27, dragging carry-on bags and clutching coffee cups with the weary resignation of frequent travelers. Among them walked Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her late 30s with short dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a plain navy sweater that made her blend seamlessly into the crowd of business travelers and vacationers. She moved through the boarding process with quiet efficiency, scanning her phone at the gate agent station without making eye contact, just another anonymous passenger on Flight 1847 to Seattle. The flight attendants welcomed passengers aboard the Boeing 737-800 with practiced smiles, their attention briefly touching each person before moving to the next face in the endless stream of travelers. Sarah made her way down the narrow aisle to seat 14F, a window seat that she had specifically chosen during online check-in. She stowed her small backpack in the overhead bin and settled into her seat, pulling out a paperback novel as other passengers continued filing past. The middle seat remained empty, but a businessman in his 50s eventually claimed the aisle seat, immediately opening his laptop and immersing himself in spreadsheets without acknowledging her presence. A flight attendant named Jessica moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead bins with the automatic movements of someone who had performed these checks thousands of times. She paused briefly at row 14, her eyes sweeping over Sarah with the same professional but distant attention she gave every passenger. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" Jessica asked with a pleasant smile. Sarah shook her head politely. "I'm fine, thank you." The exchange lasted 3 seconds before Jessica continued down the aisle, having formed no impression of Sarah beyond that of a quiet, unremarkable passenger who would require no special attention during the flight. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the businessman beside Sarah glanced over and made a casual attempt at conversation. "Headed home or traveling for work?" he asked, his tone suggesting he was simply filling time rather than expressing genuine interest. Sarah offered a small smile. "Just visiting family," she replied, her voice pleasant but not inviting further discussion. The businessman nodded, accepting this mundane explanation without question, and returned his attention to his laptop. He assumed, if he thought about it at all, that she might work in retail, or perhaps as an office administrator, or maybe she was a teacher on spring break. It would never have occurred to him that the woman sitting quietly beside him had once commanded an F-16 squadron, that she had logged over 3,000 flight hours in fighter jets, or that her call sign, Viper, was still spoken with reverence in tactical aviation circles across 3 continents. What nobody on Flight 1847 knew, what Sarah had carefully ensured would remain hidden, was that she had spent 15 years as one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. She had graduated top of her class at the Air Force Academy, excelled through pilot training with scores that instructors still referenced years later, and went on to fly combat missions over hostile territory where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. She had handled aircraft emergencies that would have killed lesser pilots, had talked wingmen through system failures while under enemy fire, and had once landed an F-16 with hydraulic failure and fire warning screaming in her headset. Her transition to civilian life 3 years ago had been driven by personal choice, a decision to step away from the constant deployments and the weight of command, but she had deliberately severed all visible connections to that past life. She never mentioned her military service, never wore anything that might identify her background, and had specifically requested that her airline reservations show no military affiliation or veteran status. The Boeing 737 climbed smoothly through 20,000 feet as the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers unbuckled and shifted in their seats, some standing to retrieve items from overhead bins while flight attendants began preparing the beverage service. Sarah remained seated, her novel open but her eyes occasionally drifting to the window, watching the Colorado landscape fall away beneath scattered clouds. The businessman beside her had dozed off, his laptop closed on the tray table. Behind her, a young mother struggled to entertain a restless toddler, and across the aisle, a college student wearing headphones nodded along to music only he could hear. It was a completely ordinary flight, the kind that happened thousands of times every day across the country, where strangers shared space for a few hours before dispersing back into their separate lives. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes and First Officer Amanda Chen ran through their cruise checklist with the easy confidence of experienced commercial pilots. Hayes had been flying for United Airlines for 22 years, with over 15,000 hours in his logbook, most of them in Boeing 737s. Chen was newer to the airline but had proven herself as a capable and conscientious first officer, someone Hayes trusted to handle the aircraft while he managed communications and navigation. The flight was proceeding exactly according to plan, following their filed route at 37,000 feet, with clear skies ahead and light winds that would put them into Seattle 5 minutes ahead of schedule. Denver Center, United 1847, Level 370, Chen radioed, confirming their altitude to air traffic control. The controller's acknowledgement came back immediately, his voice calm and routine. Everything was normal, textbook, the kind of flight that pilots would barely remember by the end of their duty day. Hayes glanced at the engine instruments, all readings perfectly within normal limits, then at the fuel quantity indicators showing exactly the consumption he expected. The autopilot flew the aircraft with mechanical precision, making tiny adjustments to heading and altitude that were smoother than any human pilot could achieve manually. This was modern commercial aviation at its finest, where advanced technology and well-trained crews combined to make flying safer than driving to the airport. The first indication that something was wrong came without warning at 38 minutes into the flight. A single master caution light illuminated on the instrument panel, accompanied by a soft chime that both pilots immediately noticed. Hayes reached forward to acknowledge the warning while Chen's eyes swept across the engine instruments looking for the problem. "What we got?" Hayes asked, his tone still casual because single cautions were common and usually minor. Chen checked the engine indication and crew alerting system display. "Oil pressure dropping on engine 2, she reported, her voice steady but more focused now. Hayes leaned forward to verify what she was seeing. The number 2 engine's oil pressure gauge, which should have been showing 45 pounds per square inch, had fallen to 38 and was still decreasing. "Pull out the QRH, Hayes instructed, referring to the quick reference handbook that contained checklists for every known abnormal situation. Chen was already reaching for it, flipping to the section on engine oil pressure problems. As she began reading the checklist items, the situation suddenly accelerated. 2 more master caution lights illuminated simultaneously, and new warnings appeared on the display screen. "Hydraulic pressure low, System A," Chen called out, her voice tighter now. "And we've got a fuel imbalance warning." Hayes felt the first touch of real concern. Multiple unrelated systems failing at once was not normal, was not something that happened in well-maintained commercial aircraft flying in perfect weather conditions. Before they could process this new information, the aircraft shuddered. It was not the gentle buffet of turbulence but a sharp, violent vibration that rattled through the entire airframe. Passengers in the cabin gasped, some grabbing their armrests as their drinks sloshed in their cups. Sarah's head snapped up from her book, her body instantly alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. That vibration pattern was wrong, was indicating something structural or mechanical rather than aerodynamic. Her eyes went to the window, scanning the visible portion of the wing and engine, looking for any sign of damage or fire or fluid leakage. In the cockpit, Hayes and Chen were suddenly dealing with a cascade of warnings that made no sense. The number 2 engine's vibration indicator had spiked into the red zone. The primary flight display was showing erratic indications from the air data computer. Warning tones were sounding in a confusing overlay of different alerts, each one demanding immediate attention. "Talk to me, Amanda," Hayes said, fighting to keep his voice calm while his hands moved automatically to start securing the failing engine. What's our priority here? Chen was scanning the displays, trying to follow multiple checklist procedures simultaneously while new warnings kept appearing faster than she could process them. Engine 2 is in the red, we need to shut it down. But we're also showing electrical system faults, and the hydraulic A system pressure just dropped to 0. She paused, her experienced pilot's mind recognizing a pattern that terrified her. Captain, these failures are not related. This is not a single system problem. We're looking at multiple independent failures happening at the same time. Hayes reached for the radio, his training taking over even as his mind raced through the impossible situation they were facing. Denver Center, United 1847, declaring an emergency. We have multiple system failures and need immediate vectors for the nearest suitable airport. His voice was controlled but urgent, and the air traffic controller's response came back immediately with the professional efficiency that characterized emergency handling. United 1847, Roger, understand you're declaring an emergency. Nearest suitable airport is Grand Junction Regional, heading 225, 60 miles. Descend and maintain flight level 240. All other traffic is being cleared from your area. The Boeing 737 was still flying, still responding to control inputs, but Hayes and Chen both knew they were in a situation that was rapidly deteriorating beyond their ability to manage. Hayes shut down the number 2 engine following the memory items he had practiced hundreds of times in simulator training, but the vibration did not stop completely. Something was mechanically wrong with the airframe itself, and with hydraulic system A completely failed, they had lost redundancy in their flight control systems. If hydraulic system B also failed, they would be left with only manual reversion, a backup system that was extremely difficult to control and provided minimal authority over the aircraft's movements. We need to run the dual hydraulic failure checklist, Chen said, her finger already marking the page in the QRH. But as she began reading the steps, new warnings appeared that made her stop mid-sentence. Captain, we're getting fire warnings from the cargo hold. And the electrical system just shed the main AC buses. Her voice was still professional, still following her training, but Hayes could hear the edge of fear creeping in because they both understood what this meant. They were not dealing with an emergency that had a procedure, not dealing with something that the aircraft designers and safety engineers had anticipated and planned for. They were facing something impossible, a convergence of failures that should not happen, could not happen according to every redundancy and safety system built into the Boeing 737. Hayes made a decision that went against every instinct he had as a commercial pilot, but that his experience told him was necessary. Amanda, I need you to go back and brief the senior flight attendant on how bad this is. Tell Jessica we may have to evacuate on landing, if we make it to landing. I need the cabin prepared for the worst case. Chen stared at him for a moment, understanding what he was really saying. He was admitting that he did not know if he could save this aircraft, that despite his 22 years of experience and 15,000 hours, he was facing something beyond his capability. She unbuckled and squeezed out of the right seat, moving quickly toward the cockpit door. In the cabin, passengers had gone from startled to genuinely frightened. The vibration had not stopped, had actually gotten worse, a grinding shudder that came in waves every few seconds. The aircraft was descending now, and people could feel it in their ears and in the changing pitch of the remaining engine sound. Some passengers were crying quietly, while others sat frozen with white knuckles gripping armrests. The businessman beside Sarah was awake now, his face pale as he looked around the cabin for reassurance that no one could provide. What's happening? He asked Sarah, his voice shaking. Is this normal? Sarah did not answer immediately. Her eyes were tracking every sensation, every sound, every subtle change in the aircraft's behavior. The vibration pattern, the smell of burning insulation that was just starting to reach the cabin, the way the aircraft was yawing slightly to the right as if one side was creating more drag than the other. Her fighter pilot's mind was already assembling a picture of what must be happening in the cockpit, what failures would create this combination of symptoms. She knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent years pushing aircraft to their limits and beyond, that this was not a situation that standard commercial procedures were going to solve. When First Officer Chen emerged from the cockpit and made her way quickly to the forward galley where Jessica was standing, Sarah watched the brief, intense conversation between the two women. She saw Jessica's face go pale, saw the first officer's hand gestures that indicated descent and emergency preparation, saw the way Chen glanced back at the passenger cabin with an expression that mixed professional composure with genuine fear. Then Chen disappeared back into the cockpit, and Jessica picked up the public address microphone with hands that trembled slightly as she began speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant. We are experiencing technical difficulties, and the captain has made the decision to divert to the nearest airport. Please return to your seats immediately, fasten your seatbelts tightly, and review the safety card in your seat pocket. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing." The announcement hit the cabin like a physical blow. The crying became louder, and voices rose in fear and confusion. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with urgent efficiency, checking seatbelts and securing loose items, their faces showing the strain of maintaining calm while knowing something was seriously wrong. Sarah looked out the window at the rocky mountain terrain passing below, calculating in her head based on their descent rate and the direction they were turning. Grand Junction was the logical choice, but depending on what was actually wrong with the aircraft, they might not have time to make it that far. She made a decision in that moment, one that would expose the carefully maintained anonymity she had built over 3 years, but that her conscience would not allow her to avoid. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the immediate protest from the businessman beside her. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated," a flight attendant called out, moving toward her. Sarah held up one hand in a calming gesture but kept moving forward toward the cockpit. "I need to speak to the captain," she said firmly. "It's important." The flight attendant, a young man named David who had been with the airline for only 6 months, moved to block her path. "You cannot approach the cockpit, ma'am. Federal regulations are very clear about this, especially during an emergency. Please return to your seat immediately." His voice had the rigid quality of someone following rules because he did not know what else to do. Sarah stopped but did not retreat, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him falter. "I'm a pilot," she said quietly but with unmistakable authority. "Fighter pilot, 15 years Air Force, over 3,000 hours in tactical aircraft. Whatever is happening up there, I might be able to help. You need to let me talk to them." David stared at her, his training completely inadequate for this situation. The procedures he had memorized said nothing about passengers claiming to be military pilots who wanted to help during emergencies. But something in Sarah's eyes, in the calm certainty of her voice, made him hesitate instead of simply refusing. "Wait here," he said finally, then moved quickly to the cockpit door and knocked in the specific pattern that identified him as crew. The door opened a crack, and David leaned in to speak to whoever was inside. Sarah could not hear the conversation, but she could see David gesturing back toward her, could see the discussion becoming more animated. After 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, the cockpit door opened wider and First Officer Chen appeared, her face showing the stress of the crisis they were managing. Her eyes found Sarah, and there was skepticism mixed with desperation in her expression. "You're a pilot?" Chen asked, her voice tight. Sarah nodded. "Air Force, retired 3 years ago. F-16s mostly, some F-15 time. I've handled emergencies that commercial training does not cover. I might be able to help." Chen studied her for a moment, and Sarah could see the calculation happening behind those eyes. In normal circumstances, no commercial airline pilot would let a passenger into the cockpit no matter what credentials they claimed. But these were not normal circumstances. "Wait," Chen said, then disappeared back into the cockpit. Sarah could hear urgent conversation, could hear the overlay of warning tones and radio communications that indicated how serious the situation had become. Then Chen reappeared and gestured for Sarah to enter. "Captain wants to talk to you. Come on." Sarah moved quickly past David and into the cockpit, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panels and taking in the full scope of what Hayes was dealing with. What she saw made her blood run cold even as her training kicked in with crystal clarity. The primary flight display was showing multiple red warnings. The engine indication screen showed the number 2 engine shut down and the number 1 engine running but with abnormal parameters. Hydraulic system A pressure was 0, and system B was showing fluctuating pressure that suggested it was on the verge of failure. The standby instruments were the only reliable flight information available, and the aircraft was shuddering with a vibration that Sarah immediately recognized as structural damage, not just engine imbalance. Captain Hayes turned in his seat to look at her, his face showing the strain of a man who had exhausted his training and was facing the reality of possibly dying along with everyone behind him. "You're a fighter pilot?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah moved closer, her hand unconsciously reaching out to brace against the center console as another shudder ran through the airframe. "Yes, sir. Call sign Viper. 15 years tactical aviation, multiple combat deployments, extensive emergency handling experience including flying damaged aircraft. What's your situation?" Hayes gestured at the instrument panel with a hand that shook slightly. "Multiple independent system failures. We shut down engine 2 due to oil pressure loss and vibration, but the vibration got worse. We've lost hydraulic system A completely, and B is degrading. We're getting intermittent fire warnings from the cargo hold that we cannot confirm or fight because the cargo fire suppression system is also failed. Electrical system has shed main AC buses, we're on backup power. And I don't know why any of this is happening. Nothing in my training explains simultaneous failures across systems that have no connection to each other." Sarah's mind was already working through the problem with the systematic analysis that had kept her alive through a dozen aircraft emergencies that should have been fatal. "How long since the failure started?" she asked. Hayes glanced at the chronometer. 8 minutes. 8 minutes, Sarah thought, and this many systems have cascaded into failure. That meant they were not looking at maintenance problems or manufacturing defects. They were looking at catastrophic damage, probably structural, possibly from an uncontained engine failure that had sent debris through critical areas of the aircraft. "Do you still have flight control authority?" she asked. Hayes nodded. "So far, yes. But if we lose hydraulic system B, we drop to manual reversion and this aircraft becomes barely controllable. I can keep us in the air, but landing with manual reversion in a Boeing 737 is nearly impossible even in perfect conditions." Sarah moved to look over Chen's shoulder at the navigation display. "How far to Grand Junction?" Chen answered immediately. 43 miles, we're lined up on a heading to intercept the ILS for runway 35. But we're only making about 1,000 foot per minute descent because I'm afraid to increase our speed with this vibration." Sarah did the math in her head. At their current descent rate and distance, they had maybe 15 to 18 minutes before landing, assuming everything held together that long. But she could feel through her feet and hear in the resonance of the airframe that they did not have 15 minutes. Something structural was failing, and when it finally let go, it would happen suddenly and catastrophically. "Captain Hayes, with respect, you're not going to make it to Grand Junction," she said quietly. "Whatever is causing this vibration is going to fail before we get there. We need a closer option, something we can reach in 5 minutes or less." Hayes stared at her, his face showing the struggle between hope that she might know something he did not and despair at hearing his worst fears confirmed. "There is nothing closer. Grand Junction is the nearest airport with runways long enough for this aircraft and emergency services on site." Sarah moved to look out the windscreen, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead. Mountains, valleys, scattered patches of snow on higher peaks, and then she saw it. A long, straight line cutting through a valley maybe 20 miles ahead and slightly to the left. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. Chen leaned forward to look. "Interstate 70. Runs through Glenwood Canyon." Hayes shook his head immediately. "You cannot be suggesting what I think you're suggesting. Landing a Boeing 737 on a highway is not realistic. It's not even survivable." Sarah turned to face him directly, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Captain, I'm not suggesting it, I'm telling you it's your only option. You have maybe 5 minutes before this aircraft comes apart. That highway is clear, it's straight, and it's wide enough if we come in at the right angle. I've landed damaged aircraft in worse conditions. On a highway? Hayes demanded, his voice rising with stress and disbelief. Sarah shook her head. On runways with no tower, no lights, no guidance systems, while taking enemy fire with hydraulics failing and flight controls barely responding. I've brought home F-16s that had no right to still be flying. I know what damaged aircraft can do and what they cannot do. This aircraft cannot make Grand Junction, but I can put it on that highway and save everyone aboard if you let me. Hayes looked at Chen, who was staring at Sarah with a mixture of hope and terror. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, and a new warning tone sounded as hydraulic system B pressure dropped another 10%. They were out of time, and Hayes knew it. Every instinct he had as a commercial pilot was screaming at him not to hand control of his aircraft to a stranger, to follow procedures and regulations and training even if it meant they all died. But he was also a realist, and he could see as clearly as Sarah that they were not going to make the airport. "What do you need?" he asked, the words coming out like broken glass. Sarah was already sliding into the jump seat behind the center console, her eyes scanning the instruments with the intensity of a fighter pilot preparing for combat. "I need you to talk to ATC and declare that we're landing on Interstate 70. I need them to stop all traffic both directions and clear the area as much as possible. First Officer Chen, I need you to handle radio communications, read checklists, and manage any system that I'm not actively controlling. Captain Hayes, you're going to stay in the left seat but I'm taking control. Keep your hands on the yoke as backup in case I need you to take over, but I'm flying. Understood?" Hayes nodded slowly, feeling the weight of command shift in a way he had never experienced. Okay. Okay, you've got the aircraft. But if I tell you to hand back control, you do it immediately. This is still my cockpit. Sarah met his eyes with a look of complete professional respect. Agreed. Now let's save this aircraft. She reached forward and gripped the control column, feeling through her hands the vibration and the slight resistance that indicated degraded hydraulic authority. "I have the aircraft," she announced formally. "You have the aircraft," Hayes confirmed, his hands moving to shadow her movements on his own control column. Chen was already on the radio, her voice tight but clear. "Denver Center, United 1847, we are not going to be able to make Grand Junction. Request immediate closure of Interstate 70 both directions in the vicinity of Glenwood Canyon. We intend to land on the highway." There was a moment of shocked silence from the controller, then his professional training kicked in. "United 1847, say again your intentions." Chen repeated the request, and the controller's voice came back with barely controlled disbelief. "United 1847, Roger, I understand you intend to land on Interstate 70. I am notifying Colorado State Patrol and Emergency Services now. Be advised, I show traffic on that highway segment. It will take several minutes to stop and clear vehicles." "Tell them we don't have several minutes," Sarah said, her hands moving across the instrument panel to reconfigure the displays for the kind of visual flying she was about to do. "We have maybe 2 minutes before structural failure. They need to do whatever they can but we're landing on that highway regardless." Chen relayed this information, and the controller's response was grim. "United 1847 understood, all emergency services are being notified. Altimeter 3012, winds 280 at 15 gusting 22. You are cleared to land, any surface, pilot's discretion." Sarah banked the aircraft left, her movements smooth despite the degraded flight controls, lining up on a heading that would bring them down the centerline of the highway. Through the windscreen, she could see the ribbon of pavement ahead, could see the tiny specks that were cars and trucks still traveling on it, completely unaware that a commercial airliner was about to land in their midst. She deployed the speed brakes to increase the descent rate, ignoring the increased vibration that came with the extended panels. "Chen, I need you to make a PA announcement. Tell the passengers to assume crash positions in 60 seconds. Be honest but calm. Tell them we're attempting an emergency landing and they need to be prepared for impact. Chen picked up the microphone, took a breath to steady herself, then spoke to the cabin. This is First Officer Chen. We are making an emergency landing. In 60 seconds, I will tell you to assume crash positions. When I give that command, bend forward, grab your ankles, and stay down until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Crew, prepare for emergency landing. In the cabin, pandemonium broke loose. People were crying, screaming, some praying loudly in different languages. The flight attendants moved through the aisle one last time, physically pushing passengers into the brace position, their own fear visible on their faces but their training holding them together. Sarah tuned out everything except the aircraft and the approaching highway. She was 4 miles out, descending through 6,000 feet, with ground speed still too high at 230 knots. She needed to slow down but could not deploy full flaps because the asymmetric hydraulic failure might cause a loss of control. She was going to come in fast and hard, faster than any commercial landing should be, but she had done this before in fighters and she knew the physics would work if she executed perfectly. 3 miles out, and she could now see individual cars on the highway. Some were pulling over, drivers having been alerted by radio broadcasts or seeing the massive aircraft descending toward them. But others were still moving, still oblivious, and Sarah knew with cold certainty that she could not avoid all of them. She was going to hit something, was going to cause damage and possibly deaths on the ground, but the alternative was a mountainside crash that would kill everyone aboard with absolute certainty. Captain, I need you to call out airspeed and altitude, she said, her voice steady. Hayes began a rhythmic cadence. 220 knots, 5,000 feet. 215 knots, 4,500 feet. 2 miles out, and the highway filled the windscreen. Sarah could see the canyon walls on either side, could see that she was going to thread this aircraft through a gap that left maybe 50 feet of clearance on each wingtip. The vibration was constant now, a grinding shudder that she could feel in her teeth. Something was very close to letting go, and when it did, they would have seconds before the aircraft became unflyable. Chen, brace for impact announcement, now. Sarah commanded. Chen's voice came over the PA, sharp and urgent. Brace, brace, brace. 1 mile out, and Sarah dropped the landing gear, feeling the heavy thunk as the wheels extended and locked. The drag increased dramatically, slowing the aircraft but also making it shudder even worse. Hydraulic system B pressure dropped to 20%, and the flight controls became mushy, responding slowly to her inputs. She added power to the single remaining engine, using thrust to help control their descent rate, walking a razor's edge between too fast and too slow. 500 feet, Hayes called out, his voice strained. 400 feet. 300 feet. Cars on the highway were pulling desperately to the shoulders now, some drivers so panicked they simply stopped in the middle of lanes. Sarah aimed for the center of the widest clear section, accepting that her wings were going to hit things, knowing that she had to protect the fuselage and the cabin where 153 people were hunched in crash positions with their lives depending on her skill. 200 feet, Hayes called. 150 feet. 100 feet. The Boeing 737 dropped below the level of the canyon walls, and Sarah could now see the texture of the pavement, could see the painted lines and the patches where the highway had been repaired. She pulled back on the yoke, raising the nose, bleeding off speed as the aircraft entered ground effect. The main wheels hit the pavement at 160 knots with a screech of tires and a violent bounce that threw everyone forward against their seatbelts. Sarah shoved the thrust levers to idle and deployed full speed brakes, the aircraft slamming back down onto the pavement and staying down this time. The noise was catastrophic. Metal screaming, tires exploding, the roar of reverse thrust from the single engine creating asymmetric deceleration that tried to yaw the aircraft off the pavement. Sarah fought the controls with every ounce of strength she had, using rudder and differential braking to keep them centered on the highway even as the left wing dipped and hit the concrete barrier separating the lanes, sending up a shower of sparks and tearing metal. The impact tore off the outboard section of the wing and the winglet, debris tumbling behind them in a trail of destruction. A semi-truck appeared ahead, the driver frozen in terror as he watched a Boeing 737 bearing down on him. Sarah aimed for the gap to the right of the truck, her right wingtip passing with inches to spare, but the left wing caught the trailer and ripped it open like paper, the impact causing the aircraft to yaw violently to the left. For a moment, Sarah thought they were going to roll, but she mashed the right brake pedal to the floor and added a burst of thrust, using raw force to muscle the aircraft back toward the center of the highway. They were down to 80 knots now, the aircraft still decelerating but surrounded by chaos. More debris was breaking off, and Sarah could smell burning rubber and hydraulic fluid. She saw a passenger car ahead, a mother with 2 children visible through the windshield, their faces white with terror. There was no room to avoid them, no time to do anything but pray. At the last second, the mother swerved off the highway and down an embankment, the car tilting dangerously but staying upright, and the aircraft thundered past with feet to spare. 60 knots, 50 knots, and Sarah could feel the aircraft was dying beneath her hands, could feel systems giving up one by one. But they were slowing, they were still on the pavement, they were somehow still together. At 30 knots, the nose gear collapsed with a grinding crunch, and the nose of the aircraft slammed down onto the pavement in a spray of sparks. They slid forward another 100 yards, the friction bringing them to a final, grinding stop. For 3 seconds, there was complete silence except for the sound of alarms in the cockpit and the hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. Then Sarah's voice cut through the shock. "Evacuate. Get everyone out now." She was already out of the jump seat, moving to help Hayes and Chen who were sitting frozen in disbelief that they were still alive. She grabbed Hayes by the shoulder and shook him. "Captain, evacuate the aircraft. You need to get your people out before something catches fire." Hayes snapped back to awareness, his training reasserting itself. He grabbed the PA microphone. "Evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. Use all exits, leave everything behind, get away from the aircraft." The flight attendants were already moving, throwing open doors and deploying emergency slides. Passengers stumbled toward the exits in a controlled panic, the training from safety demonstrations finally having purpose as they jumped onto slides and tumbled down to the highway pavement. Sarah helped Hayes out of his seat and physically pushed him toward the cockpit door. "Go, get yourself out," she commanded. Hayes stumbled into the cabin, joining the flow of passengers moving toward the exits. Chen was right behind him, but she paused and looked back at Sarah. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion and shock. "You saved us. You saved everyone." Sarah nodded, her face showing no satisfaction or pride, only the grim focus of someone who knew the job was not done until everyone was safe. She moved through the cabin, checking each row to make sure no one was left behind, finding an elderly man who had frozen in fear and physically lifting him from his seat and guiding him to the exit. She was the last person in the aircraft, standing at the door of the forward emergency exit and looking back at the empty cabin, at the scattered phones and bags and personal items that people had left behind in their rush to escape. Through the windows she could see passengers running away from the aircraft, flight attendants counting heads and trying to establish order on the highway where hundreds of people were now mixed with stopped cars and approaching emergency vehicles. Sarah jumped onto the emergency slide and rode down to the pavement, rolling to her feet at the bottom and jogging away from the aircraft to a safe distance. Only then did she turn and look at what they had done. The Boeing 737 sat in the middle of Interstate 70, its nose crumpled against the pavement, left wing torn and damaged, debris scattered behind it for half a mile. But it was substantially intact, and as Sarah scanned the groups of passengers standing on the shoulder, being checked by paramedics who were arriving from both directions, she could see that people were injured but alive. All of them were alive. Captain Hayes found her in the crowd, and when their eyes met, she saw something in his face that went beyond gratitude. It was recognition of what she had done, of the expertise that had been required to bring that aircraft down in one piece, of the reality that every person here owed their life to a woman they had not known existed 45 minutes ago. He approached her, surrounded by flight attendants and passengers who were beginning to understand who had saved them, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the highway loud enough for dozens of people to hear. Everyone needs to understand something. This woman is why you're alive. I'm a pilot with 22 years of experience, and I could not have done what she just did. She's a fighter pilot, combat veteran, and she flew that aircraft when I had given up hope. Sarah held up a hand, uncomfortable with the attention, but Hayes was not done. I want everyone here to know her name. What's your name? He asked her directly. Sarah met his eyes and saw that he needed this, needed to give her the recognition that commercial aviation procedures and regulations would never formally allow. Sarah Mitchell, she said quietly. Former Captain, United States Air Force. Call sign Viper. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, people surging forward to thank her, to touch her arm or shake her hand or simply to look at the face of the person who had saved them. Sarah accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity, but inside she felt the weight of what had happened settling onto her shoulders. She had saved 153 lives today, but she had also revealed herself in a way that could never be taken back. The anonymity she had carefully constructed was gone, destroyed in the 8 minutes and 13 seconds it had taken to bring a dying Boeing 737 down on a highway through a canyon at the edge of her skill and the limit of what was physically possible. As emergency vehicles surrounded the scene and officials began the process of investigating what would become one of the most extraordinary emergency landings in aviation history, Sarah stood apart from the crowd and looked at the damaged aircraft. Investigators would eventually determine that an uncontained failure of the No. 2 engine had sent turbine blades through the fuselage, severing critical hydraulic lines, electrical bundles, and structural members in a catastrophic cascade that should have made the aircraft uncontrollable. They would conclude that the pilots had done everything right according to their training, but that training and procedures were inadequate for the situation they faced. And they would note, in official reports that would be studied for decades, that the only reason everyone survived was because a passenger with fighter pilot experience had taken control and executed a landing that no commercial pilot was trained to attempt. But Sarah was not thinking about official reports or future training changes. She was thinking about the moment in the cockpit when she had taken the controls, when she had felt the damaged aircraft respond to her hands, when she had known with absolute certainty that she could save everyone if she was willing to risk everything on her skill. She had spent 3 years trying to leave that part of herself behind, trying to be just another ordinary person in a world that no longer required her to push machines and herself to the absolute limit. But today had shown her something she had suspected but not wanted to admit. She would never be just another passenger, because when the moment came when lives depended on expertise that only a few people possessed, she would always step forward. It was who she was, who she would always be, regardless of what she wore or how she traveled or how carefully she tried to blend into the background of ordinary life. The businessman who had sat beside her on the flight found her in the crowd, his face still pale with shock but his eyes showing something like awe. "I asked you what you did for work," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You said you were visiting family. You didn't say anything about being a fighter pilot." Sarah looked at him with a small, tired smile. "You didn't ask the right question," she replied. "Nobody ever does. People see what they expect to see, and they expect ordinary passengers doing ordinary things. They don't expect fighter pilots, because fighter pilots are not supposed to be invisible. But we are, right up until the moment we're needed. Then we're exactly who we've always been." As the sun began to set over the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across the highway where a Boeing 737 sat broken but not beaten, Sarah Mitchell stood among the survivors and accepted that her time of anonymity was over. The news would spread, the story would be told, and she would be recognized as the fighter pilot who saved Flight 1847 when no one else could. She had tried to leave that identity behind, but today had proved that some things are too fundamental to who you are to ever be truly left behind. She was a fighter pilot, had been since the day she first strapped into a cockpit, and would be for the rest of her life regardless of what uniform she wore or what name was on her airline ticket. Nobody had known she used to be a fighter pilot, but now everyone would know. And perhaps that was how it should be, because expertise that saves lives should not remain hidden in the shadows. It should be recognized, respected, and ready to emerge when crisis demands capabilities that ordinary training cannot provide. Sarah Mitchell, call sign Viper, had saved 153 lives today by being exactly who she had trained her entire adult life to be. And as emergency responders worked through the evening to clear the highway and care for the survivors, she stood quietly among them, just another person in jeans and a navy sweater, unremarkable and invisible again except to those who knew enough to recognize that the greatest expertise often travels unnoticed until the moment it becomes the difference between disaster and survival.